Richard Feynman said, "Never confuse education with intelligence. You can have a PhD and still be an idiot." What are some real-life examples of this? Story 1. My wife's stepfather was a chemist who currently has diabetes. One night, he went to the ER because his blood sugar was dangerously high. He claimed he was eating well. He normally does not, so there's no reason why his blood sugar was high. In his car was a 2-liter bottle of ginger ale mixed with grape juice. He said that the two canceled their sugars out, and we didn't know what we were talking about because he was a chemist and he knows how to combine things. Holy hell, that is insane. It is. With respect to sugar, unless you're doing a low-sugar juice, you've got the same numbers as soda because he doesn't drink diet. But when I was hearing this, I'm just trying to imagine the taste. Ugh. This happened earlier this year, and he still argues he's right. Like, dude, you add a vodka kicker to a margarita, does it suddenly cancel out the alcohol? Or is a Long Island iced tea no longer potent because you've canceled everything else out? I'm no scientist, but I've added my sodas together when I was younger, and I've never had sudden regular-tasting water. Like, he might be a chemist, but that doesn't mean he knows anything useful about diabetic biochemistry. You see this with engineers a lot, too. Engineers will be like, "I know X because I'm an engineer." No, you're a mechanical engineer who works in design and finite element analysis. You do not have the same level of clarity on nuclear reactor maintenance. Your sad devotion to that ancient religion hasn't given you the clairvoyance needed to locate the stolen If an ancient religion was giving my boss magical telekinetic superpowers, you'd better believe I would not be giving them sass. Cognitive dissonance. It's actually insane what people can convince themselves of when they really want something. Edit. I used the wrong word. Others pointed out I should have said confirmation bias, not cognitive dissonance. And they are correct. Somebody's never known the joy of a good grinder jail. Somebody ought to go to Gringer jail. I didn't know that Steve Jobs was a chemist. But for real, Steve Jobs, by all regarded as one of the most brilliant marketers of all time, and when he was diagnosed with a more treatable form of pancreatic cancer, he said, "Frack modern medicine, my organ that regulated blood sugar level, I'll just eat nothing but sugar, fruit, and that'll cure my struggling organ." Like someone with liver disease giving up water and committing only to drink beer. His stupidity in one area led to his perishing despite his brilliance in other areas. He also bought a house in another state to jump the organ donation queue and unalived that donor organ too with his stupid fruit diet. I'm literally lying in the ICU at the moment with a fresh kidney transplant, and anybody who does this smeg should be banned by UNOS, or UNOS, however it's pronounced. I'm so incredibly grateful to the woman who perished for my gift of life, and I can't wait to express my gratitude to her surviving family. May have done, but the key thing was having a private jet standing by. The key thing with transplant surgery is how quickly you can get there. The shelf life of organs is short, and Jobs had the ability to get anywhere in the continental U.S. for a transplant within 6 hours. That bumps you way up the list over someone who has a job and would take days to get to a hospital equipped for the operation. And yes, he was an utter wanker for taking organs that someone else could have lived with when his condition was pretty easily curable using modern medicine rather than pseudoscience. I think that just boils down to just because you're smart in one area doesn't mean you're smart in all areas. I didn't know that about Steve Jobs and what his disease was, but that whole thing about mixing different sugary drinks to cancel them out, it's just insane. It just sounds like he wanted to drink something really sweet and just really wanted to justify it in lieu of him actually being in the hospital. Your sugar was high. Your theory is kind of not proven. Story 2. Peter Duesberg, molecular biologist who works as a researcher at UC Berkeley and has an otherwise stellar career and well known for his work, became an AIDS denialist, claiming there's no link between HIV and AIDS, led countless people down the rabbit hole, including many who are HIV positive. These individuals ended up infecting others and refusing antiretroviral therapies. This included an AIDS denialist activist named Christine Maggiore, I'm not sure how that last name is pronounced, who infected her infant through breastfeeding, thinking, hey, it's not a big deal, it's just HIV, it doesn't cause AIDS. Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing PCR, also questioned the link between HIV and AIDS. I chatted with him on a plane once, and he was indeed pretty dumb. Edit. Dumb in many ways, but clearly unique and smart in others. I'm not here to bash Kary Mullis because PCR is cool as hell, and he seemed cool in other ways too. Met him once after a lecture at the university I was working at. It was amazing to me how he stuck to his mantra of, just a surfer dude researcher who single-handedly conceived a PCR, and conveniently left out the dozens of other scientists and technicians who helped with the preceding work and subsequent refinement of the process. Yeah, it was funny because when I met him, I was seated with him and another scientist, on a plane to Boston, of course. I was telling them both about some stuff I did with a fancy, at the time, version of PCR, and he just listened and then talked about surfing mostly, and I was thinking, who is this bozo? When I got off the plane, the other scientist was like, it's not every day you meet a Nobel laureate. And I was like, what? Who was that? And that's when he told me who it was. He had gotten Mullis' card and gave it to me, and I still have it somewhere. Also, just a surfer dude researcher who single-handedly conceived a PCR during an acid trip, so it still kind of tracks. On a similar note, there are a whole bunch of American academics of Chomsky's vintage who are Cambodian genocide deniers. They think it's an American imperialist lie meant to make a communist regime look bad. There used to be something in the 80s, there was a book about it called the Peter Principle, meaning you sort of rise up to the level of incompetence and you just stick there, your level of incompetence, and that's where you're stuck. It kind of sounds like this. People have had some successes, and then they get up to the point where they really can't get any further because they're pretty much idiots at everything else. Story 3. Not quite a PhD, but I was at a party in the UK full of med students, and stereotypically everyone was off their face drunk. Well, some guy fell over and broke his collarbone and immediately got rushed by a dozen of them, all fussing and asking him the same questions over and going through the checklist. Half an hour later, and he's still on the couch in pain, and I go in to ask if anybody knows why the ambulance is taking so long. Nobody had an answer because nobody had called one. A party full of medical students hadn't called an ambulance or made any transport arrangements for a guy in severe pain with a broken clavicle. Idiots! That's actually super common in emergencies where there's a group of any kind. One of the first things you learn in a lifeguard certification course is to identify a single person to instruct to call 911. Never just yell out, "Someone call 911," or assume that it's been done because everyone in the group is assuming someone else did it already. It's not necessarily that everyone forgot about it, just that everyone assumed it was the logical first step that someone else would have taken already. Singling somebody out tends to work because in an emergency there are 50 random people all wanting to do something to help, but none of them willing to take charge of the situation for fear of fracking it up. Single someone out, and you'll have taken charge of them and given them something to do that it's hard to be bad at. So they'll do it. Sounds like one of those situations where students or newbies in a field try to apply their newfound skills to any possible situation. I've seen it with CS students, with pole science students, and others. It's reminiscent of an oft-reposted joke about a physicist, an engineer, and a programmer trying to fix a car. There's also a saying that when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Everyone seemed to be rushing in and going through what they learned so far, which is the checklist. It's kind of weird that nobody was told to call an ambulance, or everyone assumed that the ambulance was going on. It looks like everyone wanted to contribute to the situation, but nobody wanted to take charge. I think if someone did take charge, they would have at least noticed that no one had called the ambulance, or maybe at least that person should have called the ambulance. Really frustrating, especially for maybe the guy with a broken collarbone should have spoken up and said, "Hey, who called the ambulance?" Story 4. I was at a keg party at college, and the gravity keg was set up. Someone complained that the beer was not flowing, so I checked that the keg was still almost full. Turns out someone closed the air intake on top. I opened the intake and poured myself a beer. Problem solved. A few minutes later, someone else complains that the beer is out. I told them the keg was full a few minutes ago and it was a tap problem that I fixed. They told me they just came from the keg. I go back to the keg and find the intake was closed again. Opened it and poured the young lady who said it was empty beer. As she's leaving, my suite mate comes in and goes to the intake and closes it. Now, my suite mate is a straight-A student who gets all A's, mostly due to his photographic memory. Back to the keg. So I tell him that he needs to leave the intake open to let air in to displace the beer coming out of the lower tap. He then proceeds to tell me that since the beer is carbonated, air is not needed to replace the liquid volume lost when the beer is dispensed. So I asked him 2 questions. If it's not needed, why is there the upper tap? And does he really think the amount of gas the carbonation gives off in a glass of beer is equal to the volume of the liquid beer? He thought for a few seconds, and his only response was, "I have a 4.0. What's your GPA?" Then he walked away. I seriously fracking hope that was not a real response. It seems legit. I've met enough people that if you criticize one thing, they take it as a blanket statement about the entire subject. You know, it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Timmy really should be wearing a jacket while he's sitting at the bus stop. Oh, you think I'm just a terrible person, huh? No, I think Timmy should be wearing a jacket. I hope your response was, "Awesome, your GPA matches your IQ." Well, no, the response should have been, "Can you pour me a beer?" Story 5. I worked with a girl that graduated from Boston. She would never shut up about it. Always brown this and brown that. I went to a state school, and it was apparent that she looked down on anyone that didn't attend an Ivy League school. So one day she was doing that, and I couldn't stop myself. I said something like, "Oh, you went to Brown? And yet, here we are, together in the same place, doing the same job." I had someone on my ship who wouldn't shut up about being older and college educated. She was 3 ranks below me. She had no grasp on the concept of experience. Yeah, I have a degree, but if someone has more experience, I will always listen to that for sure. Maybe it's because I have a blue-collar background. I know some that just won't listen. It never works out well for them. Mate, you cannot just end it there without telling us what her response was. That's just not fair. It did make her pause, which was a feat unto itself, but that's all. Nothing could shut her up. She was also the kind of person that would complain she was being repressed when anyone at all had a disagreement about how something should be handled. Quite possibly the least pleasant person I've ever known. Story 6. I have a PhD and I'm an idiot in most respects. All it takes to get a PhD is to be really good at or persistent in doing research in one narrow area of study. Edit. So several commentators pointed out that I simplify things too much. A PhD also requires hard work, luck, and some basic competence in a topic, but that doesn't preclude one from being completely clueless in other aspects of life. The best quote I've heard about this is, "They don't give PhDs to the smartest people. They give them to the most stubborn." True. I quit my PhD. Everyone felt so sorry for me. They shouldn't. It was a great life move. The thing I learned most in academia, an area of learning, is don't get into academia. Yep, I left my PhD behind and took the MS. My advisor was an unhappy, abusive man who thought his coworkers in the department were morons and treated them as such. and encouraged his graduate students to treat their peers that way. I went from 190 pounds to 260 pounds during grad school from depression eating. COVID didn't help, because there was no way you could win in that lab. Successes were because you got lucky. Failures were because you were incompetent and not because you were using equipment from the 50s or reagents older than you. Leaving was the best thing I could have done. Now I have a nice government job, make more than any of the people in that lab, and have lost 50 of the 70 pounds I've gained. With everything going on about the rise of college expenses, I think more and more people are starting to question college education in general, not just PhDs and such. And it sounds like a lot of people are doing this work for the better and making more money and losing weight, so good for them.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 7. I had a professor for higher mathematics who had real difficulties figuring out how to extract a cup of coffee from the vending machine. Bless him. I had a student job doing IT for the classroom equipment at my college. My job wouldn't have existed if having a PhD meant you could figure out technology. I once was a student resource coordinator at a university. Once, a computer science professor was having trouble with a computer and projector displaying his presentation. The whole class laughed when I asked him if he checked his connections, and it turned out his computer wasn't plugged in. I once had the privilege of telling a $300 an hour IT consultant that the reason his presentation screen wasn't working was that he'd unplugged it to charge his laptop. I work with lawyers, and I'm convinced they trade every other brain cell they have for their law degree. Sounds like a relative of mine. A PhD in veterinary medicine by 30, has worked on genetic research in dogs and developed a new technique on measuring canine metabolism. Same person spent 2 whole lessons of driving school trying to figure out how the steering wheel works. Edit. To be clear, I don't think she's an idiot. The comment just reminded me of her. Sometimes I think she just processes things differently from most people. Story 8. I worked IT for a hospital. I was speaking to a doctor who forgot his password. While he was spelling his name phonetically over the phone, he said Z as in xylophone. Needless to say, my eyebrows raised. I work in software development for a major chain of hospitals. One of the executives, MD, asked me to make a substantial UI change to a product owned by McKesson. Them. Just change the colors. It's simple. My teenager could do it. Me. I can make the request to the vendor. Them. That's ridiculous. You just need to go in there and change it. Out of spite, I made the request with the vendor, and they came back with a quote that was more than 2 liver transplants. The executive told my CTO I was being difficult and couldn't perform simple tasks. He literally did not understand that vendor software was different from a Wix website. When I worked in hospital administration, I was told I needed to code up a game for iOS and Android from scratch in 2 weeks. This direction came from an MD, a C-level executive, and a lawyer. At the time, I had no coding skills to speak of. I was just a young person who liked computers and could do HTML. I didn't even work in IT. The conversation with them about how that would be impossible was interesting. Story 9. My first call at my first IT job was in a medical laboratory. There was a doctor who had been in the job for years, and she called saying her computer would not power on. I walked her through some troubleshooting and nothing worked. Is the computer plugged in? Okay. Is the monitor on? Okay. When did the problem start? Types of questions were asked, and she answered them all. I go up to her office, and indeed the computer is plugged into a power strip, which is plugged into itself. Cleaning crew had deep cleaned her office and never plugged anything back in. Doctor plugged the power strip into itself, thinking that as long as it was plugged in, that's all she needed. Part of me wonders if she got the cords mixed up, like she thought what she was plugging in was something other than the power strip. Depending on the length of the cords, I could see it getting lost in the tangle and just plugging it in. The cord was only about 6 feet long and you could easily see the whole thing. I unplugged it from itself and plugged it into the wall. Easiest fix ever. It was the first thing in the morning at about 7 a.m., so maybe she wasn't fully awake. Story 10. I have a PhD and I work with a bunch of PhDs. Basically, A lot of them think that because they succeeded in one area, they're an expert in every other area in life, and they always have strong opinions about everything. I think it's also called a PhD syndrome. I think my imposter syndrome cannibalized my PhD syndrome. One of the main benefits from my education was to teach me how much I don't know. It's baffling to me that people get confidence to speak on things they don't know anything about just because they're educated. Some people leave graduate programs still convinced they're never not been the smartest motherfrackers in the room. No clue how they manage that, but they're out there. Story 11. I worked for a statistician who had a PhD in statistics and was dumb as a post. On the other hand, I worked with this really smart guy who happened to have a PhD, and as he said it, all that means is I did the work for a PhD. I worked with a climate scientist who could analyze climate data like nobody's business, but if you wanted him to do literally anything else, you had to hold his hand the entire time. Zero common sense, too. The senior staff at that office idolized him because of the PhD after his name, but one time he was in a car accident in a work vehicle, also his fault, and I asked for a copy of the police report for insurance purposes, and he said he didn't get one because, I thought you handled that. Why would I, who was not present at the time of the accident, have the police report that was written at the time of the accident? The other guy that you ran into has one. Story 12. I went to 3 ERs when I felt something was wrong with my arm. It felt like a bug bite day 1, and by day 4, a bungee cord from my elbow to my wrist. 3 doctors said it was a skin irritation or dermatitis. I kept telling them something was wrong. I have no medical degree. I work in property management. Day 5, I walk into another ER and said, I don't care if I have to pay out of pocket or sit here all night, but something is wrong with my arm. Finally, after many rude looks and comments, I was given an ultrasound of my arm. Then I was rushed to an MRI. Then I was told I was being admitted. A 3-inch blood clot in my upper arm, 2 in my chest area, and 1 had passed my lung already. Diagnosed with factor 2 gene mutation 22 days later. Blood clotting disorder. Damn, good for you being persistent. That's pretty wild that they missed that. I'm glad you did finally get a proper diagnosis. Did you call back to the other places to tell them what jerks they were? Never call the others back. Doubt they would have cared. Story 13. I had a boss who was an engineer who put a couple $100 in change in a bank's pneumatic drive-through tube where it got stuck and they had to use a jackhammer to get it out. He was upset that the bank was charging him for this because he didn't know this would happen. They had large signs saying not to put change in the tubes, including on the tubes themselves. He just filled the thing with random change, not in rolls or anything, like he thought it was a frackin' Coinstar? That's hilarious, unless you were in line behind him. Yep, and it sank and got stuck underground. Way too heavy for the pneumatic system to carry it to the teller. Story 14. My ex-boyfriend's mother was a linguistics professor and knew over 10 languages. She was one of the dumbest people I've ever met. Some examples. She believed that in case of emergency, stewardesses catapult out of the plane. She was also convinced donating blood causes some blood disease and you can perish because of it. But my favorite one was when she said her son's orthopedic problems are not a result of a serious injury he had. His knee hurts because he eats too much ketchup. Man, that ketchup is going straight to my knees. I'm gonna need to sit for a minute. Story 15. My college roommate, the smartest person I've ever met, spent nearly an hour trying to shove a desk back into the corner of our room at an angle. She wouldn't listen to me because, in her words, she got this. After she finally gave up, I walked over, pulled the desk out completely, and straightened it with the wall, and pushed it back in. One movement. No struggle. Many a time we had where I'd realized she might be the smart one, but I've got more common sense. Story 16. My professor, a brilliant neurosurgeon, once decided to directly smell a bottle of ammonia. He then told me, "Don't smell that." I didn't plan to.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.